Good morning, everybody. It's so good to see you this morning. Welcome back to a live. Okay, it's early. I didn't sleep very well last night. So, good morning, everybody, and welcome back to Arise with Sally Goodwin live on Facebook. Now, I'm not sure what's going on with my phone today. But it seems to be, I don't know whether it's doing things the right way around. So if it isn't, I'm sorry. Good morning, Stuart. So nice to see you this morning. So if I sort of look to the side, it's because for some reason the comments are coming up on the side. I don't know what's happened. I've obviously done something or pushed something or not turned something, or I don't know what I've done. Anyway. Technology, I'm still learning. Stuart, I don't know. I need you to be my cameraman and my editor again. For all of you people who've been watching my Rise channel for a while, and remember the videos in the beginning that were so professionally done, that was all Stuart. Cameraman and editor extraordinaire, available for anybody who's looking for somebody. But but we're in a stage where we have to do these things ourselves. So that's where we are right now. Well, that's where I am right now. Hopefully you're in a different stage. Anyway, good morning, everybody. Welcome to Arise with Sally Goodwin, live on this beautiful Thursday morning. And we are continuing with our theme of unveiling the Bridegroom. And for those of you who listened to my sermon, I preached a sermon at our church in Durbanville, Impact Church in Durbanville, on Sunday morning, called Unveiling the Bridegroom. And it's on my Rise page. It's a SoundCloud, so it's just the audio, not a video. And as part of the sermon, I spoke about the Hebrew marriage contract, the ketubah, that was adhered to in ancient days. And so as part of our Unveiling the Bridegroom, we are going to look today at the genealogy of Jesus, because as we all know, Jesus is our ultimate bridegroom, and we are preparing ourselves to be his bride. And he is going to be our bridegroom. And in ancient days, the ancient Israelites, the Hebrew people, and I think they still do it today to a degree, they used to draw up what they called a ketubah, a marriage contract. And that marriage contract was an extremely detailed contract. And part of that marriage contract contained the history of the bride and the groom. So it was the full family history of the groom and the full family history of the bride, and everything that was in their families and all of their forebears and the tribes that they came out of and all of that kind of thing. So it was very, very interesting that they did that sort of thing then. And as part of unveiling our bridegroom, and in line with the Hebrew way of having a ketubah or a marriage contract, which is basically what we have with God, because our ultimate covenant that we enter into with the Lord will be a bridal covenant. It will be a marriage covenant when the Lamb marries his bride. That will be our ultimate covenant with the Lord. And so we're going to begin at the beginning with the ketubah, with the genealogy of Jesus. And I'm going to turn to Matthew chapter 1, because Matthew was a very detailed guy. And when he wrote the book of Matthew, he included, for the benefit of all the people to come, the exact genealogy of Jesus, so that nobody could doubt that the prophecies, that Jesus was the prophecies being fulfilled. So in Matthew chapter 1, it starts with the book of the ancestry or genealogy, and I'm reading from the Amplified Translation, of Jesus Christ, the Messiah, the Anointed, the Son, descendant of David, the Son, descendant of Abraham. And then it goes on to say, Abraham was the father of Isaac. Isaac the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, Judah the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. Now hang on a second. Can we stop right there? Because a woman is mentioned in the genealogy of Jesus. Tamar. Tamar is the very first woman mentioned in the book of Matthew, in the genealogy of Jesus. She's not the only one, and we're going to look at the others. But I want to start with Tamar. So you would imagine that in order to make it into the genealogy of Jesus, that you would have to be a pretty special person and have it all together and kind of, I don't know, be all the things that we expect people to be today, particularly women. And some of what I'm going to talk about today speaks to that whole thing. You know, that thing that we speak about where we say that God qualifies. God doesn't call the qualified, he qualifies the called. And to a degree, that statement is quite correct. And these women that we're going to look at in the genealogy of Jesus are proof of that statement. However, there is another side to that statement where, for example, if you felt that God was calling you to be a doctor, it would be difficult for you to go to a hospital and say, God has called me to be a doctor, and so here I am. I don't need to get a medical degree. I'm just going to come here and be a doctor. In that case, that statement would not apply. So that statement can be taken very out of context, as many, many other things are done, as we as believers are so good at doing. In fact, I saw a mug the other day that said, I can do all things with a verse taken out of context. And I thought that was quite good, because as believers, we definitely are very capable of that, of doing all things with a verse taken out of context. So but these women in the genealogy of Jesus are really, they are living proof of that statement that God doesn't call the qualified, he qualifies the called, because none of these women, as we'll see, actually qualified to be in the genealogy of Jesus, and yet there were. So the story of Tamar was a very interesting one, and her story is told in the book of Genesis, and it is in Genesis chapter 38. So we all remember Judah. Judah was one of Jacob's sons, and chapter 38 in the book of Genesis starts with, at that time Judah withdrew from his brothers and went to lodge with a certain Adulamite named Hira. Now Judah withdrew from his brothers because the rabbinical teachings or Hebrew scholars say that he was racked with guilt over what they had done to Joseph. That he was so racked with guilt over what they had done to Joseph that he couldn't actually live amongst his brothers anymore, and he withdrew and he went to live with an Adulamite named Hira. And what happened, the consequence of that, was that he met a daughter of Shua, a Canaanite woman, and married her, which was in clear contradiction of God's instructions to the Israelites to not marry women outside of their nation. And he had 3 sons, and his sons were called Er, Onan, and Shelah. And so Judah's life doesn't seem to have gone very well at that point in time, because Judah took a wife for his son, his firstborn son and she was Tamar. But it says in verse 7 that Judah's firstborn was so wicked in the sight of the Lord that the Lord slew him. He was so wicked that God killed him. I mean, that's quite hectic, eh? He was so wicked that God killed him. Now, the tradition or the law, the way things worked in those days, was that if you were married, because women were nothing in those days, they were nothing. They were simply possessions. They were the most oppressed people group of the time. They were possessions, they were objects just to be handed from one person to the next. Fathers traded their daughters for family alliances, for land, for position, for authority. Women were chattels, they were objects, they had no rights, they had no voice, they had nothing. So in order to prevent women just being left to sort of, die on the side of the road kind of thing, the law stated that if a woman was married to a brother and the brother died, then the woman would then be married to the next brother if the next brother wasn't married, and then married to the next brother, and so on and so forth. It also stated, though, that if the first brother died childless, then the children of the next brother would actually be seen as children of the first brother, and so the inheritance would still go to that, like the children seen to be the children of the first brother, not the second brother. It was a whole very, very complicated and seemingly it doesn't make a lot of sense to me, but anyway, a whole complicated arrangement. So what happened with Tamar is the Lord slew because was so wicked, and then Tamar married Er's brother Onan. Okay, so but Onan knew, it says in verse 9, Genesis chapter 38 verse 9, Onan knew that the family would not be his. So when he cohabited with his brother's widow, in other words, when he had sex with her, he made sure that she didn't conceive. So he had sex with her, but he made sure that she didn't actually conceive a child, because he knew then that he would be raising up a child basically for his brother. Okay? And this thing displeased the Lord, because God is trying to ensure the genealogy of Jesus, okay? So this displeases the Lord, so the Lord smites Onan. So God has now killed two of Judah's sons. He's killed he's killed Onan, okay? Right. So now we get to the last son, which is Shelah. So now Judah only has one son left, Shelah. And Judah is now petrified because remember that the ancient peoples also, they were much more spiritual people than today. They didn't have our Western mindset. They didn't have our Western worldview. They were much more spiritual. They believed in spirits. They believed in angels and in things like that. So they had no issue believing, in God smiting people and things like that. And so he was petrified that somehow or other, Tamar had been involved in some kind of curse, and now that if he married her off to Shelah would also die. So he sends Tamar back to her father's house, and he basically says to her, because the youngest son was too young, according to Judah, he says, wait until Shelah's grown older, and then. Now, you need to understand something. Tamar was now nothing. She was nothing. She wasn't married. She had had two husbands that had died on her. Her father-in-law had not followed the correct Jewish tradition and procedure and married her off to his next son. She was a widow. She had no standing in the community. She had a father-in-law who had refused to look after her, who had sent her back to her father, who didn't want her because he had given up responsibility for her and handed her over to the father-in-law. She was nothing. She meant nothing. Whatever tiny little minute bit of rights or voice or anything that the Israelite woman may have had in those days, a widow with no family and no one to support her, no children, was less than nothing. A widow was nothing. A widow with no children to support her was less than nothing. She had no future. She had no hope. She had nothing. And there was no one else would touch her. So it's not like her father could marry her off to somebody else. So what would land up happening with women like that is, because all they are is a burden on their family, because the father's family now has to feed them and look after them, they landed up in prostitution. They landed up in all sorts of things because to try and support themselves, because nobody would look after them. And this is after God has told the Israelites about looking after the widows and the orphans. And this is why God is so big on watching after the widows and the orphans. So Tamar goes off, and she does what we would consider to be a terrible thing. She hears eventually that her mother-in-law has died, and she knows that, and Judah has gone through the traditional period of mourning, and then Judah goes off, and he's going to go to a sheep shearing ceremony, and these sheep shearing ceremonies, apparently according to Jewish history were basically festivals, like sheep shearing festivals filled with drinking and debauchery. That was basically what went on at a sheep shearing ceremony. And so what she does is she goes along the road, she waits along the road, and she veils herself like a temple prostitute. And she offers Judah sex. And he says yes. He doesn't find it at all strange that a temple prostitute is just on the side of the road, nowhere near the temple. He doesn't question that. But he doesn't have anything to pay her with. So she says, okay, what can I give you because I'll have to send payment to you. So she asks him for his signet. She asks him for, it says here, your signet, your signet or seal, your signet cord, and your staff. He gave her all the things that basically proved his identity and his authority. He just handed them over to her. His signet ring, his signet cord, his seal, his staff, he just handed them over to her. Those were the things that made a man in those days, that proved who he was and what his authority was. He just handed them over to her. She took those things. She has sex with him. She falls pregnant. She goes home, back to her father's house. They find out she's pregnant. She's now pregnant, out of wedlock. Judah now has a valid reason not to marry her to his younger son because she has been sleeping around. He comes and says he's going to burn her at the stake. This is what he's going to do because this is what happens in those days. He's going to burn her at the stake. And she says to him, she sends the signet ring and the seal and the staff to him, and she says it is this man's things whose child I'm carrying. And he realizes that it is his babies that she's actually carrying. And he then realizes, and it says in Genesis chapter 38, verse 26, and Judah acknowledged them and said, she has been more righteous and just than I, because I did not give her to Shelah my son. And he did not cohabit with her again. And then she had the twins. She had Zerah and Perez. And Judah, it's according to rabbinical tradition, looked after her for the rest of her life, and she stayed with him as his wife, but he never slept with her again. So this is Tamar. This is Tamar, who is the first woman in the genealogy of Jesus. A woman who had to use all her feminine wiles to actually ensure that her life meant something. Now, do you think that God approved of all of that? No. I don't think that God approved of any of that. And can we just acknowledge the random things that had to work together for her to actually achieve what she wanted to achieve? The things that had to go exactly according to plan for her to achieve what she wanted to achieve. That she had slept with him that one time and she fell pregnant immediately. The fact that she had to take the risk that she would have the opportunity to return his things to her before her father or one of her relatives or Judah himself killed her. She took enormous risk. And she did this, she must have known. Somehow or other, I have to believe that God's hand was on Tamar, even in this horrendous, horrific story, that God's hand was on it because Judah was not doing what he was supposed to have done to ensure the lineage of Jesus. And God stepped in and he used a woman. So now we're going to go on. So we go on from Tamar, and we go on to Perez, the father of Hezron, Hezron the father of Aram, Aram the father of Amminadab, Amminadab the father of Nahshon, Nahshon the father of Salmon. Sorry, I've just lost my place. The father of Salmon. Salmon, the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. Oh, do we remember Rahab? Do you remember Rahab? can we just have a quick refresher of the story of Rahab? So the story of Rahab takes place in Joshua chapter 2. In Joshua chapter 2, the Israelite spies, Joshua has sent out 2 men secretly to go and check out the land of Jericho before the Israelites go and try and, they want to see what they're up against in the land of Jericho. And they went, it says in Joshua chapter 2 verse 1, and they went and came to the house of a harlot named Rahab and lodged there. So Rahab had 3 strikes against her. She was triply marginalized, okay? She was a woman, she was a Canaanite, and she was a prostitute. Okay, Rahab, 3 strikes against her. 3 strikes and you're out. Okay, 3 strikes against her. A woman, a Canaanite, a prostitute. Can I tell you how God saw Rahab? Let me tell you this. Rahab, she was a prophet. In Joshua 2 verse 9, she said to the men, I know that the Lord has given you the land, and that your terror is fallen upon us, and that all the inhabitants of the land faint because of you. Rahab prophesied hope and faith into the hearts of the Israelites via Joshua's spies, as well as prophesying the ultimate fate of Jericho and the surrounding land. She reminded them of just who their God was. For the Lord your God, he is God in heaven above and on earth beneath. This is in Joshua 2 verse 11. Rahab was a prophet. Rahab was a faith-filled warrior woman. She risked her life and the life of her family to hide the Israelite spies. She had so much faith, demonstrated through obedience, that James mentions her. In James 2 verse 25, it says, so also with Rahab the harlot, was she not shown to be justified, pronounced righteous before God by good deeds when she took in the scouts or spies and sent them away by a different route? James used Rahab as proof of the fact that faith without works of obedience is dead. Rahab, right? Thirdly, she was redeemed. There is a scarlet thread of redemption that runs through the Bible, and in Rahab's story, it is a literal scarlet thread that she bound in her window so that the armies of Israel would know that her and her family were to be kept safe. But the redemption didn't end there. In Matthew 1 verse 5, Salmon, the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab became a part of the genealogy of Jesus. Her scarlet thread of redemption in the natural became a scarlet thread of redemption in the spiritual. She married Salmon, who was apparently one of the spies Joshua sent out, and birthed Boaz. Can you believe it? Can you believe it? This is Rahab, and she is in the genealogy of Jesus. Let's move on. So Salmon, the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. Boaz, the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. Obed, the father of Jesse. Now Ruth gives us a whole nother story, and we all know the story of Ruth. And Ruth was also, she wasn't an Israelite. Ruth was a Moabite. Rahab was a Canaanite. These were Gentile women, people. Gentile women that appear in the genealogy of Jesus that God used. And Ruth, the story of Ruth, I'm not going to go into the story of Ruth too much. We all know it, and I don't want to be here all morning. But the story of Ruth and Naomi is so much more than just the story of a woman who was a really good friend. It's actually the story of the church and Israel. And I would like to suggest that we as a church, we look at our relationship with Israel and the Jewish people in light of Ruth and Naomi's story. Remember that Ruth was a Moabite, a Gentile who lived in Moab and would have worshipped the false gods her people did. She knew of the God of Israel, but hadn't yet committed to him, because she said to Naomi, your God shall be my God. She hadn't committed to him yet. And yet it was her love for Naomi and her willingness to step into an uncertain future with her that led her to meet the God of Israel and play an extremely important role in the lineage of Jesus. The story of Ruth and Naomi is the story of the church and of Israel. It's the story of the Gentile and the Jew. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you. Let that be the story of the church in Israel. Let us remember God's promise in Genesis that he would bless those who blessed Abraham's descendants and curse those who cursed them. Let us remember that in Romans 11, verse 17 and 18, it says, but if some of the branches were broken off, while you, a wild olive shoot, were grafted in among them to share the richness of the root and sap of the olive tree, do not boast over the branches and pride yourself at their expense. If you do boast and feel superior, remember, it is not you that support the root, but the root that supports you. Remember that we are the ones who have been grafted in. So there we go. And then we move on from Ruth. Jesse, so Ruth, Boaz the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth, Obed the father of Jesse, Jesse the father of King David the father of Solomon, whose mother had been the wife of Uriah. Now, I don't know why they don't actually mention Bathsheba's name in the genealogy of Jesus, because Bathsheba was the wife of Uriah. But she was the woman who was just bathing on her rooftop one day, as was a commonplace occurrence in those days, in the early days of Israel. And King David was supposed to be at war. He wasn't even supposed to be there. And he saw her, and he wanted her, and he sent his men to get her. And it is not necessarily always emphasized how she must have felt about that. She was married, she had a husband. Nowhere does it say she didn't love her husband. Nowhere does it say that she wanted to be with David. She was basically, David used his position as king to take Bathsheba against her will, as far as we know. It could have been rape, it could have been coercion, it could have been all sorts of things. He was the king. She could not say no. And then to add to that, he has her husband killed and marries her. I think today she would have needed a lot of inner healing, counseling, sozo. I think she probably needed it in those days. The one saving grace for her was that she bore Solomon, and Solomon was the one who took over the kingship of Israel from David. That was God's promise. So here we have these women. We have Tamar, we have Rahab, we have Ruth, we have Bathsheba. We have Tamar, who prostituted herself in order to bear children that would be Judah's. We have Rahab, who was a prostitute and not an Israelite, a Canaanite. We have Ruth, who was a Moabite who worshipped false gods. We have Bathsheba, who was basically kidnapped and raped by David, and her husband killed, forced to marry him, and then had Solomon. But, ladies, these women's names are written in the Bible, in the genealogy of Jesus. Their names are in the genealogy of Jesus, because God does not always call the qualified. Sometimes he qualifies the called. And as women, how often do we disqualify ourselves from what we feel God has called us to? Because we think we can't, because we feel like our past disqualifies us, because we feel like our marital state disqualifies us, because we feel like our color disqualifies us, because we feel like our age disqualifies us, because we feel like our culture disqualifies us, because we feel like our gender disqualifies us. How many times do we as women disqualify ourselves because of numerous things, when the Bible tells us that in all of those women who were in the genealogy of Jesus, there were numerous reasons, numerous things that should have disqualified them from being part of the genealogy of Jesus, and nothing did. Nothing disqualified them. Do you think the God that laid the foundations of the earth, that knew exactly what was going to happen to his son before the foundations of the earth were even laid, did not know that these are the women that were going to be in the genealogy of Jesus? Do you think that God, who knew that a teenage girl called Mary, who we're going to talk about next Tuesday, was going to bear his son, did not know that these 4 women were going to play this enormous part in the birthing of the Messiah? 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah. 4 women mentioned in the genealogy of Jesus. Wow. Wow. And they weren't put there by mistake. Matthew specifically mentioned them because the scriptures were Holy Spirit inspired, and God wanted their stories to be in there. God wanted their stories to be in there so that women for generations to come would know that nothing disqualifies them from stepping into what God has called them to. Nothing. And ladies, I don't often do this. But I want to give you an activation today. I want you to do something for me. No, not for me, for you. I want you to do something for you. Today I want to give you some homework. Because what we do as women is we walk around with labels that the world has given us. Single, fat, thin, black, white, colored, not feminine, too girly, too short, too tall, not clever enough, too loud, too much, too little, not enough, not good, not a good mother, not a good wife, not a good sister. We walk around with labels that the world puts on us. From the moment we are born as women, the world starts to label us. And we live with those labels often our whole entire lives. Just like Rahab. 3 strikes and you're out. I want you to do some homework for me. I want you to write down 3 labels that the world has placed on you. I want you to get a pen and paper and physically write them down. 3 labels that you feel that the world has placed on you. And then I want you to ask God for 3 replacement labels from the throne room of heaven. Ask him how he sees you. Remember Rahab? Woman, Canaanite, prostitute. Prophet, faithful, warrior woman, redeemed. I want you to ask God for 3 labels from the throne room of heaven, his labels for you. I want you to write those labels down on a separate piece of paper. Now, I want you to trade those labels with him. I want you to repent if you've partnered with those labels. Repent for that. I want you to forgive anyone who you know who gave you those labels. Forgive them for that. Repent for partnering with those labels. Forgive the people who labeled you like that. Then I want you to hold that piece of paper in your hands with the old labels on. As a prophetic act, offer it up to him and burn it. Burn it. And then receive the labels that he has given you on that other piece of paper. Tell him out loud that you accept them. And then stick that piece of paper somewhere, on your mirror, on the inside of your cupboard, wherever you need to do. Stick that piece of paper somewhere, and every single day for at least a month, 30 days, remind yourself that you are who God says you are. Ladies, let God label you, not the world. If those 4 women can be in the genealogy of Jesus, those 4 women are part of the family history of our bridegroom that we are going to enter into a marriage contract with. If those 4 women were not disqualified from playing their part in bringing our Messiah to earth, neither are you. Neither will you be. So I bless you as you go and do that homework with God. Please do it. Please do it. Please do it. I bless you with wisdom and revelation. I bless you with eyes to see and ears to hear exactly what God has to say about you. I bless you with encounters directly from the throne room of heaven. I bless you with the ability to hear the audible voice of God, the booming voice of God tell you who you are. And I decree and declare that the moment you have done this homework, you will walk in the identity of someone who has a place in the bride, in the bridal party, when that marriage happens with the Lamb. I love you. Thank you for watching. I hope this is the right way around, because it doesn't look the right way around to me, but I hope it is. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys on Tuesday. Love you lots. Bye.